Today we're going to talk about experimental design. So I'd like you to turn into your study guides to the Experimental Design 1 section. Now let's begin with an observational study. In an observational study, we observe outcomes without imposing any treatment. We simply observe what the participants do naturally. So an observational study is basically a collection of data from individuals that's already happened. We collect this data, we analyze this data, and we try to make assessments about this data, perhaps to relate to the population itself. So once again, an observational study, basically we observe outcomes without imposing any treatment at all. In an observational study, investigators observe subjects and measure variables of interest without assigning treatment to the subjects. The treatment that each subject receives is determined beyond the control of the investigator. For example, suppose we want to study the effect of smoking on lung capacity in men. Now, in an observational study, we could, for example, find 100 men age 40, of which 50 have been smoking a pack a day for 10 years, while the other 50 have been smoke-free for 10 years. Once we found those individuals, we could actually measure their lung capacity for each of the 100 men. So this is an observational study because we didn't impose any treatment. We just found individuals that we could study based on their past experiences. Then we can analyze this data, interpret it, and draw conclusions from the data itself. So once again, in an observational study, we do not impose any type of treatment. We collect past or historical data and use it to try to draw conclusions from it. Now on the other hand, in an experiment, we actively impose a treatment in order to observe the response. So once again, an experiment is where we actively impose a treatment in order to observe the response. So when you're trying to decide whether something's an observational study or an experiment, the question that you have to ask yourself is, did we actually impose a treatment on the individuals? If we did, it's an experiment. If we didn't, it's an observational study. So in an experiment, investigators apply treatments to the experimental units. Now, experimental units can come in many forms. Oftentimes they're people, sometimes they could be animals, plots of land, etc. And then once we apply the treatments to the experimental units, then we proceed to observe the effects of the treatments on the experimental units themselves. Again, let us consider the effects of smoking on lung capacity in men. So for an experiment, we could find 100 men aged 20 who do not currently smoke. We randomly assign 50 of the 100 men to smoking treatment and the other 50 to the no smoking treatment. Those in the smoking group would smoke a pack a day for 10 years, while those in the control group would remain smoke-free for 10 years. After that period of time, we would measure the lung capacity for each of the 100 men. Now, it might be difficult to find these individuals who would be willing to actively have this treatment imposed on them. So sometimes getting the experimental units to participate in some type of experimental study is a very difficult thing to do, as in this case. In some experiments it's not so, because the outcomes or the effects of what we're trying to study may not be as harmful as in this particular example here. Now, once we conducted this experiment and got both our treatment group and our control group, then after that period of time we're going to analyze, interpret, and then draw conclusions from the data. And hopefully if the experiment was performed appropriately, we're going to find that we could actually get a cause-effect relationship between the variables of interest in our study. Here it would be on whether cigarettes really impact lung capacity. Now, I'd like to talk about some important terms in experimental design. So before we begin our studies of experimental design, let's go ahead and define some foundational terms. Now, let's begin with the experimental unit. Now, the experimental unit is the single individual